Bonjour, et messieurs et mesdames. Ça va bien? J'ai ici en Canada je parle en autovlog sur ma grand-père et ma grand-mère. Mon grand-mère parle français, et ma mère parle français, mais je crois not so much. In Canada here, you know, we speak Joad. So, trauma, addiction, and intergenerational suffering. Today is November 11th. We had World War II, and I think it's interesting to look. You get to see how my brain works in this. I think it's interesting to look at something like World War II, and look at it from your point of view. Not necessarily World War II, but look at anything from your point of view when you're looking at somebody else. You know, it's kind of like seeing yourself and seeing others kind of becomes the same thing. You break down this concept of self and others, and that's kind of beneficial in terms of seeing the affinity between self and others, in terms of not just positive things or beneficial things, but in terms of negative things as well, because seeing that and recognize that can be very incredibly beneficial, right? And so in Canada in World War II, you know, my understanding is that we had this over-the-top kind of concept. So a lot of Canadians were in the front trench, and you would have a commander, usually a British commander, and they would command you to run over the top of the trench and charge the enemy, and just kill as many people as you can. And many people got killed in the process because the enemy would kill as many people as they can, conversely. And so it's interesting to think about how that negatively impacted my family, which is not something that you would assume to directly impact my family in the present day, but it does to some degree. And now I'm not saying that it wasn't worth it. Like, I'm not saying that it would have been more beneficial to have the Nazis, like, rule the entire world or something. You know, I'm not like that. But at the same time, it's interesting to look at it in terms of how that impacted my family. So with my grandfather, mon grand-père et mon grand-mère. Mon grand-mère et moi, le nom c'est même elle est Aurore, je suis Aurore. When my grandfather left for World War II, I think he married my grandmother first before he went. And my grandmother said that he was like the most wonderful man she had ever met, right? And then he comes back, and she said he was the most miserable bastard you'd ever want to be around. He most likely came back with PTSD, which is a very logical thing. One of the things they did in the trenches was they rationed alcohol. And the reason why they did that was not because it gives you the sensation of being warm, but because it kind of cuts the misery of something like a miserable life out a little bit, but also because it numbs you, right? Because you're suffering. suffering psychological trauma in the process, right? How can you not, right? And so when he came back home, he basically just sat in his armchair and drank until one weekend he drank himself to death. Apparently, my Uncle Bob had to take him and pick him up and put him in bed. He said he was a heavy bastard, was his words exactly. And my grandmother had to go out and work. She had to go out and work and make money to feed the family and pay the bills, right? Because my grandfather was incapable of that, and likely the reason being PTSD, right? And I don't think she ever really got mad at him either. I think it was all just part and parcel of the war. And so that destroyed my mother's family. In my mother's family, they had, well, one interesting thing about before my grandfather passed away, he was very paranoid, and he said he outlawed French in the house. He thought everybody was talking about things behind his back, and he outlawed French in the house. And then he died drinking a flat of beer in his armchair. And conversely, as negative and horrible as that sounds, you know, I'm also here today. You know, I'm not living under a Nazi regime, and nor am I, you know, and I exist. You know, it's like not like my family got wiped out. You know, like apparently when the Nazis invaded Germany, you know, Hitler's advice on how to deal with Poland was just plow it. It's insane, but that was the plan. You know, so my grandmother had to work, pay the bills, and be the mother and the father and run the household and do everything with my mother. So there was my aunt, the eldest one, my Aunt Linda, who was essentially the mom of the kids. She was the eldest. Then there was my Auntie Wiz, then my Auntie Piggy, and then my Uncle Bob, who we also called Uncle Tubby, because he was a little chubby. my mom, Sasso. And my mother got the name Sasso because apparently she was very sassy. I don't know where, I can't see that in myself at all. I mean, I'm not somebody to give anybody sass either. I don't know if it's genetic or something, but I'm certainly not mouthy. And so there was strife, you know, there were problems in that family. You know, a teenage girl can't necessarily raise, you know, 4 kids on her own, right? Including herself. You know, and my grandmother was just flat out busy. My grandmother just, from the time my grandfather got home for the war, my grandmother basically just worked like a dog for her entire life, apparently. And that impacted my mother in certain ways. It impacted my mother's personality, thought, and action, and established her kind of demeanor, and that in ways affected my family, or my upbringing in some ways too. And I'm not here to like haul my mother out over the coals. I'm just saying that there was this generational impact, and one of the generational impacts was alcoholism. So my grandfather came back as an alcoholic. My grandmother was an alcoholic, although my biological father was also an alcoholic, biological donor, maybe that's a better word. And then me, I'm also an alcoholic, recovered alcoholic. And so in a way I learned alcoholism, and another way, like, no, we'll talk about that. Another way I learned how to not be an alcoholic at the same time from my parents. My stepfather, conversely, a German guy, he came over to Canada from after World War II as soon as he could. He was 16, his girlfriend was 12. They came over here, I think, and they got married, or they got married and came over here, something along that line. he moved on to the outskirts of a native reserve, I think in Ontario, and then and literally built they lived in a shack, and then had 3 kids in this shack that he literally built from scrap. And he would say stories about like being in Germany, stuff like they were so poor. His father apparently was a diplomat, and because of that, his family was put under house arrest by the Russians, and he had to do things. He would go through things like go to look for wood, and he said you couldn't find sticks. I'm like, what do you mean? He's like, you could find trees, but you couldn't find sticks. You couldn't find kindling to make a fire because so many other people had been through the woods to pick up the sticks, the kindling, right? And then he said one time that the family was starving so hard, and they knew the family next door was slaughtering some goats, and they sent him over to go beg for a scrap of anything, and apparently he came back with a goat head, and they boiled that and ate it. And that was kind of like, I mean, that's interesting to look at it, like how, not just how Canadians suffered, but like how Germans suffered in World War II. You know, everyone, including the Germans and the Jews in Germany, you know, and other people around the world suffered at the hands of the Nazi regime, right? I think that's important to keep in mind. And so, but I think another interesting reflection too is, you know, when you're dealing with like trauma, addictions, and intergenerational suffering, learned patterns like alcoholism. I mean, alcoholism could be partly genetic. It could be partly learned. It could be both. You know, there could be genetic triggers that eventually happen, and a person becomes an alcoholic, just like many, many other things. And so, like, if you look at other families, and so I'll use First Nations people as a prime example. First Nations people in Canada are people who are oppressed in Canada. It's just that simple. It's just a very negative viewpoint a lot of the time around First Nations people. They went through a Holocaust, a genocide type thing. It was very much like we came over and colonized, and we were very ruthless. If you look at like the Biaktuk in Newfoundland, there's no more Biaktuk because we shot them for sport, right? I mean, that's one prime example of how it was when we came over, and we just came in droves apparently, and we came for the natural resources because Europe was suffering in terms of natural resources. And like, as much as I think, you know, and I look at something from every angle, right? So like, you can say, okay, well, Europeans, you know, English, UK, I'm English, French, Irish, and a little bit of German. You know, like I have ancestors from France, I have ancestors from England. You can say that they came over and colonized and were very, very ruthless about it, right? That's true, but it was also in a period in time, right? I mean, every culture, every civilization, you know, suffers a certain level of ignorance because of a period in time. Now, I'm not saying that that is an excuse, right? Nor am I saying that I did that, right? I'm not saying that I did that. I'm saying that this was a thing about a certain period in history that went down, you know, that was part of my ancestry, part of my culture, or something like that. You know, so it's both, right? But in terms of intergenerational suffering, if you look at First Nations people due to the oppression and suffering that they have suffered, and you know, and when people are oppressed, you know, when you're existing within a majority that won't let you, when you're a minority that exists in a majority that won't let you to grow at all, right? You know, you end up turning in on yourself, right? You end up finding ways to like do things like almost like self-medicate. Like I bet you any money that a lot of people you see out there like doing fentanyl and stuff like that, it's probably a form of self-medicating, right? So you just see people who are debased, you know, broken down, destroyed in a way, right? Hindered, harmed, damaged in a way. I'm not saying that like these type of people who are like that, you know, these different peoples who are like that are permanent like that. I'm just saying that there's just this period in time where it's like this is happening, you know, to these peoples. And so I think it's interesting to look at something like, you know, the things like alcoholism, things like family abuse, things like all these negative things that you think you just brush off and walk away from, you know, that are largely due to oppression. You know, when I think it's valuable to understand that a lot of these things occur due to oppression, I think when people have the ability to thrive, they thrive. You know, but when they don't have the ability to thrive, you know, they suffer. And you look at something like residential schools, you look at something like opioid crisis, alcoholism, you look at things like the native scoop, you know, scooping natives out and putting them into like foster homes, you know, and these sort of things. This is suffering that occurs generation by generation by generation by generation by generation by generation, right? You know, this isn't, you know, people will say things like, have some personal level of accountability. Okay, that makes sense to some degree. You know, I get that. You know, we all have to have some level of personal accountability, right? But you have to have room to have a personal level of accountability, right? You need somebody to take their foot off of you in order to get your face out of the mud. You know, you can't oppress somebody and hold them down and say, have some personal level of accountability, right? When you're the person who's got your foot on their neck. You know, and when it's intergenerational, you know, you lose sight and you lose touch of the fact that, you know, this is largely to do with oppression, right? Because most peoples, you know, regardless if they're European or African or Middle Eastern or Egyptian or French or Italian or from Turkey or wherever, you know, you can pick around the world, South America, whomever, you know, people thrive when they can. It's just an aspect of being human, you know. There's so many things too that like become not just learned behaviors, but genetic in ways. You know, apparently it's really interesting to look at genetics versus environment. These two things work in tandem a lot of the time, and sometimes what's environmental alters the genetics. It's so hard to give specific examples and being politically correct at the same time. I've heard stories of like intellect is genetic, but it's also partly environmental. So it's probably habitual, you know, cultural, habitual, familial kind of thing, but it's also something that can develop within a genetic line, you know, through the process of creating that, you know, through the process of like actually elevating the level of intelligence through person, through person, through person, through person, through this habitual practice and stuff like that. Anyways, we're going on 20 minutes. That's my rant for the day. And so I think it's important to like break down the barrier between self and other, and to like look at a situation from a selfless point of view, or look at a situation from a point of view of self. You know, when you're looking at, when you're critiquing or analyzing somebody else, right? You can, for example, you can say that with First Nations people in Canada, you know, I hear a lot of people, especially people who immigrate, look and they say, oh, look at these people, they're all this, they're all that, they're all alcoholics or something, you know. And one issue can be that alcoholism can be genetic. Addictive personalities can be genetic, you know, but you not inherit those